It wasn't a gunshot or a whispered threat that caught the most dangerous man in the city off guard. It was a curse word, muttered under the breath of an overworked waitress carrying a tray of dirty glasses. 5 syllables of perfect biting Calabrian dialect that no one in this sterile, neon-lit city had any business knowing. He stopped dead. The blood in the room seemed to run cold. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't want answers. He just wanted her. The clock above the espresso machine was stuck. It had been stuck at 1:14 a.m. for the last 3 years, but tonight Norina felt it in her bones. Her shift was supposed to end at midnight. She stood in the service alley by the kitchen doors, a damp rag hanging limp from her right hand. The soles of her cheap black shoes were worn thin, offering zero protection against the hard, greasy tiles of Tavolino's floor. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She didn't have the energy to complain. Complaining took breath, and she was saving hers for the long walk to the bus stop in the freezing rain. "They're ordering another round of the Barolo," Sarah whispered, appearing beside her. Sarah was 22, a theatre major, who still thought working in an authentic downtown Italian restaurant had charm. Tonight she just looked pale. Her hands were shaking. Norina looked through the porthole of the swinging kitchen door. The main dining room was empty chairs stacked upside down on the tables, save for the large booth in the deep back corner. 6 men sat there. They didn't look like the movies. They didn't wear pinstripes or fedoras. They wore tailored wool coats, dark, understated crewnecks, and the kind of heavy, silent watches that cost more than Norina's life insurance payout. They took up space differently than regular customers. Regular customers shrank into the booths, trying not to be an inconvenience. These men sprawled. They owned the air. At the head of the table sat Vincent. Norina didn't know his last name, but she knew the manager Bruno had practically swallowed his own tongue when the man walked in an hour ago. Vincent looked to be in his late 30s. He had a face carved from tired stone, lined with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with paranoia. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't eating. He was just listening to the man beside him talk, his dark eyes fixed on the tablecloth, a silver Zippo lighter turning endlessly between his scarred knuckles. "Get Bruno to pour it," Norina said, turning back to the stainless steel prep counter. She picked up a stack of dessert menus and began wiping them down with harsh industrial sanitizer. The smell of bleach cut through the lingering aroma of garlic and burnt sugar. "Bruno is hiding in the walk-in cooler," Sarah said, her voice tight. "He told me to take it out." "Norina, I can't. That guy on the end. The one with the neck tattoo, he keeps looking at my legs. I feel sick." Norina paused. She looked at Sarah. The girl's eyes were wet. It was the kind of terror that came from recognizing a predator in the room. Norina sighed. It was a heavy, ragged sound. She tossed the rag onto the counter. She didn't feel brave. She didn't feel protective. She just felt deeply, profoundly irritated. She wanted to go home. She wanted to take off her shoes. If she had to deal with a table of mobbed-up sociopaths to get there, fine. "Give me the bottle," Norina said. Sarah practically shoved the heavy, dark bottle of vintage Barolo into Norina's hands, fleeing toward the dish pit. Norina grabbed a clean white towel. She pushed through the swinging doors. The dining room was silent, except for the low, aggressive hum of the men's voices and the relentless patter of rain against the front windows. As she approached the table, the conversation didn't stop. They didn't acknowledge her. She was part of the furniture. A ghost in an apron. The man with the neck tattoo. A kid, really maybe 25, hyped up on something chemical, was leaning across the table, jabbing a finger at the man across from him. "I'm telling you it's garbage," the kid said. His voice was too loud for the empty room. The whole operation down south. Garbage. They don't respect the old ways, they just pretend to. They talk that peasant shit and expect us to bow down. Norina stepped to the right of the table. She uncorked the bottle with practiced mechanical efficiency. The pop sounded loud in the tense air. "Watch your mouth, Carmine," an older man muttered, cutting his steak. Carmine scoffed. "Why, it's the truth. Fucking southern trash. They eat dirt and pretend it's pasta. What do they call it? Pasta alla norma. It's slop." Norina began pouring the wine into the large crystal glasses. She kept her face entirely blank. She had learned Italian from her grandmother, a woman whose knuckles were permanently swollen from scrubbing stone floors in a village outside Palermo. Norina knew the dialect. She knew the cadence. She knew the soul of it. Hearing this coked-up middle-management thug butcher the culture while wearing a $3,000 suit grated on the very last frayed nerve she possessed. She finished pouring for the older man. She stepped to Carmine. Carmine didn't stop talking. He gestured wildly. His hand slammed into the base of the glass just as Norina was pulling the bottle away. The heavy crystal tipped. Red wine splashed across the stark white tablecloth. A few drops hit the cuff of Carmine's shirt. Silence slammed down onto the table like a physical weight. Carmine looked at his cuff. Then he looked up at Norina. His eyes were dead flat and instantly furious. "You stupid bitch," he snarled. Norina didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She just stood there, the heavy bottle of Barolo in her right hand, her left hand resting casually on her apron. "I apologize," Norina said flatly. Her tone conveyed zero actual apology. It was the automated response of a service worker who had endured far worse from far better men. "I'll get a cloth for the spill. You'll get a cloth." Carmine shoved his chair back. The legs scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. He stood up. He wasn't exceptionally tall, but he was wide-built for violence. He stepped into her personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale sweat. "Do you know how much this shirt costs, huh? You think your entire pathetic life could pay for this?" The other men at the table watched. They didn't intervene. They looked bored. This was theatre to them. At the head of the table, Vincent slowly stopped turning to the Zippo. The metal clicked shut. He didn't look at Carmine. He looked at Norina. "It's a splash of wine," Norina said. She kept her voice low. She refused to step back. If she stepped back, he would step forward. It was basic physics with men like this. "Club soda takes it right out. Now if you'll excuse me." She turned to walk away. Carmine grabbed her upper arm. His grip was a vice, his fingers digging into her bicep hard enough to bruise. "I didn't dismiss you," Carmine spat. "You clean it up. Now. On your knees." Norina froze. The physical pain in her arm flared sharp and hot, but it was eclipsed instantly by a cold, sudden rage. It was the rage of a double shift, the rage of a late bus, the rage of being touched by a man who thought fear was a currency. She didn't think. The filter between her exhausted brain and her mouth completely evaporated. She turned her head. She looked Carmine dead in his bloodshot eyes. "Levati I mani di codu pezzo di fango, o ti faccio mangiare u sanguto." The words ripped out of her. They were low, raspy, and entirely feral. It was an ancient, brutal Sicilian dialect. "Take your hands off me, you piece of dirt, or I'll make you eat your own blood." It wasn't just the words. It was the accent. It was the hard consonants, the guttural roll of the R's, the absolute, unwavering authenticity of it. It was the sound of the old country spoken not by a mobster pretending to have roots, but by a woman channeling generations of hard, unforgiving matriarchs. Carmine blinked. The sheer shock of it loosened his grip. He didn't speak the dialect fluently, but he understood the violence in the tone. Before he could recover, Before he could escalate, a voice cut through the air. Carmine. It was a quiet word. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Vincent had spoken. Carmine froze. He slowly released Norina's arm, taking a half step back, his eyes darting to the head of the table. Boss, this stupid— Sit down, Vincent said. His voice was a rasp like sandpaper on iron. Carmine snapped his jaw shut. He sank back into his chair, glaring at the tablecloth. Vincent finally lifted his gaze. He looked at Norina. Norina rubbed her arm, her breathing slightly elevated, but she held his stare. Vincent's eyes were black, not dark brown. Black. They absorbed the dim light of the restaurant. There was a dangerous, hyper-focused stillness to him now. The boredom was gone. He tilted his head. He studied her face, her cheap uniform, the frayed collar of her shirt, the dark circles under her eyes. Dionisi? Vincent asked softly. Where are you from? He spoke in standard Italian, but his accent carried the faint, undeniable ghost of the same southern grit Norina had just used. Norina gripped the neck of the wine bottle. Her heart was beating a little faster now. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the cold reality of what she had just done. She had threatened a made man in front of his boss. Chicago, Norina said in English. Her voice was flat. I was born in Chicago. Vincent's mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile. But your tongue was born in Palermo. Norina didn't answer. She turned away from the table, walking straight back to the kitchen. She didn't look back. She pushed through the swinging doors, set the Barolo down on the prep counter with a loud clack, and leaned heavily against the metal sink. Her hands were shaking now. Sarah was cowering near the dish rack. What happened? I heard yelling. Are you okay? I'm fine, Norina lied, turning on the cold water and splashing it on her face. He spilled his wine. He's an idiot. Are they leaving? I don't know and I don't care, Norina said, drying her face with a paper towel. I'm clocking out. If Bruno wants to fire me, he can call me tomorrow. She walked toward the back office, untying her apron. She had one arm out of it when the kitchen doors swung open again. It wasn't Bruno. It was the older man from the table. He stood in the doorway, blocking the exit. He wore a heavy grey suit. He looked like a retired boxer who had moved into accounting. You're not clocking out, the older man said calmly. Norina stopped. My shift ended an hour ago. Your shift ends when Mr. Costa says it ends, the man replied. He didn't move. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have to. He wants you back out there. Bring a new glass. Norina looked at the man. She looked at the heavy door behind him, leading to the alley. It was blocked. She could scream, but who would hear? The dishwashers had left at 11. Sarah was useless. Bruno was hiding. She took a slow, deep breath. The exhaustion settled back into her bones, heavier this time. She tied the apron back around her waist. She grabbed a clean crystal glass from the rack. Fine, Norina said. The dining room felt colder when she returned. The dynamic at the table had shifted. Carmine was sitting, rigidly staring straight ahead, his face flushed with humiliation. The other men were quiet, eating their food with forced concentration. Vincent was exactly as she had left him. Still, watching. Norina approached the right side of the table. She set the clean glass down in front of the older man, purposefully avoiding Carmine. Pour, Vincent said. Norina stopped. She looked at him. Vincent was pointing a finger at his own empty glass. She walked to the head of the table. She picked up the bottle of Barolo. She stood right beside Vincent. Close up, he smelled of rain, expensive tobacco, and a faint, metallic scent that she didn't want to think too hard about. She poured the wine, filling the glass to the exact correct level. She stepped back. Anything else? Vincent picked up the glass. He swirled the dark red liquid, watching the legs form on the crystal. He didn't drink. What's your name? Vincent asked. He was speaking English now. Norina. Norina. He tested the name. He found it acceptable. You work hard, Norina. I work for money, Norina corrected him bluntly. Not for fun. One of the men down the table choked slightly on his water. Vincent didn't break eye contact. Honest, Vincent murmured. I appreciate honesty. It's rare in my line of work. I don't know what your line of work is, Norina lied smoothly. And I don't want to know. You already know, Vincent said softly. You knew the moment we walked in. You knew exactly what Carmine is, which is why you used the dialect. You didn't just insult him, Norina. You challenged his bloodline. You told him he was a fake, a street dog pretending to be a wolf. Norina shifted her weight off her aching left foot. I lost my temper. It was unprofessional. It won't happen again. No, Vincent agreed. It won't. He finally took a sip of the wine. He swallowed, set the glass down, and leaned back in his chair. He looked at her not with lust, but with a cold, terrifying curiosity. It was the look of a man who had suddenly found a masterwork painting hanging in a dirty alleyway. My grandmother spoke like you, Vincent said quietly. The table was deathly silent. No one was eating now. They were all listening to their boss share a personal detail, something none of them had likely ever heard him do. She was from a village outside Trapani. Hard woman. She survived a war, a famine, and my grandfather. She had a voice like crushed glass. Just like yours. Norina gave him nothing, no sympathy, no connection. That's a nice story. If there's nothing else with the food, I have cleaning to do in the back. Vincent let out a short, dry exhale. A laugh without the humor. You really aren't afraid of me, are you? I'm afraid of getting evicted. Norina said, her voice utterly devoid of emotion. I'm afraid of the gas bill. I'm afraid of the D train running late, so I have to walk 8 blocks in the dark. You. She looked at him, taking in his tailored clothes and his silent, violent guards. You're just a guy who takes up a table past closing time. The older man who had corralled her from the kitchen stepped forward, his face hardening. Show some respect. Vincent held up a single hand. The older man stopped instantly. Vincent stood up. He was taller than she realized. He towered over her, casting a long shadow across the white tablecloth. He stepped around the chair, closing the distance between them until he was only 2 feet away. Norina forced herself to hold her ground. She tilted her chin up to look him in the eye. Up close, the exhaustion in his face was even more apparent. There were grey hairs at his temples. He was a king, but the crown was burying him alive. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Norina's muscles locked, preparing for a weapon, but he pulled out a thick silver money clip. He peeled off 5 $100 bills. He held them out to her. For the delay, Vincent said. Norina looked at the money. $500. It was a month of groceries. It was peace of mind. She looked back up at him. The tip goes on the bill. It's pooled with the kitchen. This isn't for the kitchen. This is for you. Norina didn't move her hands. I don't take charity, and I don't take hush money. Pay your bill up front and leave. Vincent stared at her. The air between them pulled taut, vibrating with a strange, heavy tension. It wasn't romance. It was recognition. 2 incredibly tired people staring at each other across a massive, bloody divide. Slowly, Vincent lowered the money. He put it back in his pocket. Paul, Vincent said without breaking eye contact with Norina. The older man stepped forward. Yes, boss. "Find Bruno," Vincent ordered quietly. "Tell him the restaurant is closed tomorrow, and the next day. Tell him I'm buying out the dining room every night this week." Paul blinked, confused. "Boss, we have the sit-down with the Greeks." "Move the sit-down here," Vincent said, his dark eyes locked onto Norina's. "And tell Bruno he's reassigning the staff. No one serves my table but her." Norina's stomach dropped. "No, I'm not doing that. I have assigned tables." Vincent ignored her. He turned to Paul. "Clear her schedule," Vincent commanded softly, the absolute authority ringing in the empty room. He looked back at Norina, his gaze dropping to her mouth, before rising back to her eyes. "I want her." The "closed for private event" sign hanging on the front door of Tavolino's was crooked. Norina stared at it through the rain-streaked glass. It was Tuesday, 3 p.m. The street was slick with oil and city grime. She hadn't slept. Her apartment radiator was broken again, and the draft from the window had kept her staring at the ceiling, replaying the gravelly sound of Vincent Costa's voice telling his men he wanted her. She pushed the door open. The bell didn't ring. Someone had taped the clapper. The dining room was already unrecognizable. The tables had been pushed together to form one massive, singular block in the center of the room. The cheap, ambient string lights had been unplugged. The only illumination came from the heavy brass chandeliers overhead, casting harsh, interrogative pools of light over the newly laid, double-starched white tablecloths. Bruno was sitting at the bar. He had a glass of antacid in one hand and a ledger in the other. He looked like he had aged a decade overnight. "I'm not doing it," Norina said. She didn't take off her damp coat. She dropped her bag on a bar stool. Bruno flinched. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. "Norina, please, sit down." "I'm not sitting. I'm quitting." She reached into her pocket, pulling out her brass name tag, and tossed it onto the mahogany bar. It landed with a dull clink next to Bruno's Pepto-Bismol. "Mail my last check, or don't. I'll find a diner job by tomorrow." Bruno stared at the name tag. He didn't touch it. He looked back up at her, and the raw panic in his face stopped Norina from turning around. "They paid the lease, Norina," Bruno said. His voice was a hollow rasp. "The building lease. For the whole year." Paul, the older guy in the grey suit, came in at 9 this morning. He handed me a cashier's check for $80,000. He told me the restaurant is theirs for the week, and he told me that if you aren't wearing an apron at 5 o'clock, he's going to burn the building down. With me in it. Norina crossed her arms. "He's bluffing. It's a scare tactic." "Did he look like a man who bluffs?" Bruno whispered. "Did any of them?" "They aren't local thugs, Norina. That's the Costa family. They own the sanitation union. They own the docks. If they want to torch a mid-level pasta joint on 4th Street, the fire department will conveniently take 40 minutes to respond." He leaned forward, bracing his weight on his elbows. "I have a daughter in college. I have a mortgage. If you walk out that door, you ruin me." Norina closed her eyes. She pressed the heels of her hands against her temples, feeling the dull throb of a caffeine withdrawal headache beginning to form. She hated Bruno. He chronically understaffed the floor and skimmed the credit card tips. But she didn't want him dead. She didn't want his daughter to drop out of school because a sociopath in a tailored suit had decided to play games. "Where is Sarah?" Norina asked quietly. "Sent home. Paid in full for the week. Everyone is. The dishwashers, the bussers. The only people in this building tonight are me, Chef Artie in the back, and you." Norina opened her eyes. She looked at the massive table in the center of the room. It was set for 10. Heavy crystal glassware. Silverware polished until it looked like surgical steel. "Who is coming?" she asked. "The Greeks," Bruno said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. The Kostopoulos brothers. They run the imports out of the East Harbour. There's been a turf war bleeding into the suburbs for 6 months. This is a sit-down to end it. Or escalate it." Bruno swallowed hard. "You serve the food. You pour the wine. You do not look them in the eye, Norina. I am begging you. Do not speak that hillbilly Italian to them. Be a ghost." Norina picked up her name tag. The cheap brass felt heavy in her palm. "Fine," Norina said, "but my hourly rate just went up to $50. Cash. At the end of the night." Bruno nodded frantically. "Done. Whatever you want." Norina walked back toward the locker room. The kitchen was dead quiet. Chef Arte, a massive man who usually screamed to the rhythm of heavy metal during prep, was silently butchering a veal loin. He didn't look up when she passed. The air in the building had fundamentally changed. It felt pressurized like the atmosphere right before a tornado touches down. At 4:45 p.m., the black SUVs began pulling up. Norina stood by the espresso machine, watching through the front blinds. They parked illegally, half up on the curb. Men in dark overcoats stepped out into the rain. They didn't huddle or run. They took up positions at the front door, the alleyway, and the corners of the street. Then the front door opened. Paul walked in first, his eyes scanning the empty booths before locking on to Norina. He gave a single curt nod. Vincent followed. He wore a dark navy suit today, the cut flawless, the fabric absorbing the harsh light of the chandeliers. He took off his wet overcoat, handing it blindly to a man behind him without breaking his stride. He walked straight to the head of the long table and stopped. He looked at Norina. Norina looked back. She wore her standard uniform black slacks, white button-down black apron. Her hair was pulled back into a severe utilitarian bun. She held a stack of linen napkins. "You stayed," Vincent said. It wasn't a question. The distance between them was 30 feet, but his voice carried perfectly in the silent room. "I'm a hostage on a payroll," Norina replied flatly. "Let's not confuse it with loyalty." A faint, sharp smirk touched the corner of Vincent's mouth. It was gone a second later. He pulled out his chair and sat. "Bring me a black coffee. No sugar." Right away. Norina turned to the machine. She locked the portafilter into the group head and hit the switch. The loud mechanical grind of the beans broke the suffocating silence. She didn't let her hands shake. She watched the dark liquid drip into the porcelain cup. She was pouring the coffee when the door opened again. The Greeks had arrived. They were louder than the Italians. 4 men walked in, bringing the smell of cold rain and aggressive spicy cologne with them. The man at the front, who Norina assumed was the elder Kostopoulos brother, was built like a brick wall. He had a thick greying beard and eyes that darted constantly around the room, taking in the exits, the sight lines, and the placement of Vincent's men. Vincent didn't stand up. He remained seated at the head of the table, his hands resting flat on the white linen. "Elias," Vincent said. His voice was neutral. "Vincent!" Elias replied, his accent thick. He didn't take off his coat. He sat at the opposite end of the table, 30 feet of white cloth separating them. His 3 men took seats along the right flank. Vincent's men, Paul Carmine, and another quiet enforcer, sat on the left. The table looked like a battlefield drawn in silver and crystal. Norina picked up a silver tray carrying 3 pitchers of ice water and walked onto the floor. She approached Elias first. It was proper service protocol guest of honor, or in this case, the rival boss. She poured the water. Elias didn't look at her. He was staring down the length of the table at Vincent. "You bought out the whole place," Elias noted, his voice booming slightly. "Seems like an expensive way to have a conversation about a few missing shipping containers." "Privacy is expensive," Vincent said. "And the containers aren't missing, Elias. We both know where they are. They're sitting in a warehouse in Queens." My warehouse. Norina moved down the table, pouring water for the Greek enforcers. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of adrenaline radiating from the men. Underneath the table legs were bouncing. Hands were tucked close to waistbands. She reached Vincent's side of the table. She poured for Paul, who gave her a polite nod. She reached Carmine. Carmine glared at her. A bruised, ugly purple mark showed on his jawline, something that hadn't been there the night before. Norina realized with a jolt of cynical clarity that Vincent had likely put it there for his outburst. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. She poured his water perfectly steady and moved to Vincent. She set the black coffee down by his right hand. Vincent didn't look at the coffee. He looked at Elias. The terms are simple. You stay out of the West Docks. You pay a 15% tax on whatever moves through the East. In exchange, the containers in Queens are returned to you untouched. Elias laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. 15%. You're out of your mind. We agreed on 8 last year. Last year your cousin didn't try to bribe my customs agent, Vincent replied, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. The stillness in him was terrifying. The price of doing business has gone up. Consider it a penalty for sloppy work. I consider it robbery. Elias slammed a heavy ringed fist onto the table. The silverware jumped. Norina was standing 3 feet behind Vincent, holding the silver tray against her hip. She didn't flinch at the sound. She had spent 5 years working the closing shift at a bar near a minor league hockey arena. Men slamming tables didn't scare her. Vincent finally picked up his coffee cup. He took a slow sip. He didn't turn around, but he spoke over his shoulder. Norina, stand here. Norina blinked. Excuse me. Stand beside me, Vincent repeated softly. Don't go to the kitchen. Norina hesitated. Bruno's instructions screamed in her head. Be a ghost. But the man paying the rent was telling her to anchor herself in the crossfire. She stepped forward, standing directly to Vincent's right, just slightly behind his chair. Elias frowned, his thick brows knitting together. He looked at Norina, truly seeing her for the first time. What is this, Vincent? You need a waitress to hold your hand during a negotiation. I like her company, Vincent said smoothly. He didn't look at Elias. He looked at his coffee. She has a very grounding presence. It reminds me not to lose my temper with people who bore me. The insult hung in the air heavy and deliberate. The Greek enforcers stiffened. Carmine leaned forward slightly, anticipating an order. Norina felt the heat of a dozen eyes on her. She hated it. She hated being used as a prop in a dick-measuring contest between mobsters. I need to check on the first course, Norina said, her voice tight, intending to step away. Vincent reached out without looking. His hand clamped around her left wrist. His grip wasn't brutal, like Carmine's had been, but it was absolute. It was warm, dry, and unyielding. The veal will wait, Vincent said softly. He finally turned his head to look up at her. The exhaustion in his dark eyes was momentarily replaced by a sharp, probing intensity. Stay. Norina looked down at his hand on her wrist. She could cause a scene. She could pour the ice water pitcher over his head. It would be a phenomenal way to die. She slowly relaxed her arm. She didn't pull away. She just stood there, the silver tray resting against her hip, trapped in the orbit of the most dangerous man in the city. Fine, Norina muttered loud enough only for him to hear. But I'm charging you by the minute for babysitting. Vincent's chest hitched, a tiny, almost invisible exhale of amusement. He let go of her wrist, leaving a phantom warmth on her skin. He turned back to Elias. 15%, Elias. And I want an answer before the main course is served. The first course, a bitter radicchio salad with shaved parmesan, was served in agonizing silence. The clinking of forks against china sounded like gunshots in the empty room. Norina stood by the service station, a clean towel draped over her forearm. She watched the table. She read the men like she read a rush-hour dining room. The older Greek boss, Elias, was chewing his food aggressively, a muscle ticking in his jaw. The man to his right, a younger guy with a shaved head and a scar bisecting his eyebrow, wasn't eating at all. His hands were under the table. Norina's stomach tightened. She stepped over to Paul, who was standing by the pillar, observing the room. "The bald one on the right," Norina whispered, pretending to inspect a stack of dessert spoons. Paul didn't look at her. "What about him?" "He's right-handed. He cut his meat with his right hand when he first sat down, but for the last 10 minutes, his right hand has been in his lap, and he's drinking water with his left." Norina kept her voice completely conversational, a bored waitress killing time. "He's gripping something. His shoulder is locked." Paul's eyes darted almost imperceptibly toward the Greek side of the table. His posture didn't change, but Norina saw the subtle shift in his weight. He was no longer resting on his heels. He was on the balls of his feet. "Go to the kitchen, Norina," Paul said very quietly. "Right now." Norina didn't argue. She turned and walked toward the swinging doors. She was 5 feet away when Elias Kostopoulos shoved his salad plate away. It skidded across the tablecloth, stopping inches from the edge. "We are not paying 15, Elias barked. "We'll pay 10, and we take control of the Southern Transit line. That is the final offer, Vincent." Vincent wiped his mouth with his linen napkin. He placed it neatly beside his plate. "There are no counter-offers, Elias. You don't have the leverage. Your men are disorganized. Your supply lines are bleeding. I'm offering you life support, and you're haggling over the hospital bill." The bald Greek enforcer leaned forward. "You talk too big for a man sitting across from 3 guns. The room snapped. It happened faster than Norina's brain could process. Vincent didn't flinch, but Paul moved with terrifying speed. Before the bald man could bring his right hand above the table, Paul was already there. He grabbed a heavy crystal water pitcher from the center of the table and brought it down with sickening force onto the bald man's hand, crushing it against the edge of the thick oak table. The crunch of breaking bone was loud. The crystal pitcher shattered instantly, sending shards of thick glass and a flood of ice water exploding across the pristine white linen. The bald man screamed a high, agonizing sound. He tipped over in his chair, clutching a hand that suddenly looked like a ruined piece of meat. Every man in the room stood up. The scraping of chairs was deafening. Guns were drawn. The metallic clack-clack of slides being racked echoed off the mahogany walls. Elias stood frozen, staring at his screaming enforcer, his own weapon halfway out of his coat. Vincent was the only man who hadn't moved. He was still sitting, his hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. He looked at Elias with utter boredom. "Tell your dogs to heel, Elias," Vincent said softly. "Or none of you are walking out of this restaurant." Elias looked at Paul, who had a suppressed pistol aimed directly at his forehead. He looked at Carmine, who had a gun pointed at the third Greek's chest. Slowly, Elias raised his hands. He took his hand off his weapon. "Put them down," he ground out to his men. The tension in the room remained thick enough to choke on. The bald man was groaning on the floor, weeping in shock. "Take him to a hospital," Vincent ordered, waving a hand dismissively. "We agree on 15%. You have 48 hours to clear out of the West Docks. Get out of my sight." Elias didn't say another word. His remaining man hauled the injured enforcer to his feet. They dragged him toward the door, leaving a trail of bloody water across the hardwood floor. The front door clicked shut. The silence that returned was heavy ringing in Norina's ears. Vincent's men slowly lowered their weapons. Norina stood by the kitchen doors. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs, but her face was a mask of cold, hard annoyance. She looked at the ruined table, the shattered crystal, the blood seeping into the expensive white linen. "God damn it," Norina muttered. She walked over to the service station. She grabbed a thick, heavy-duty trash bag and a pair of leather work gloves Bruno used for taking out the alley dumpsters. She walked back to the table. Vincent watched her. His men watched her. No one spoke. Norina walked right up to the shattered mess. She pulled on the thick leather gloves. She picked up the heavy blood-stained shards of crystal and dropped them into the trash bag. Clink. Clatter. "You're paying for the tablecloth," Norina said, her voice completely devoid of fear. She was running on pure irritated adrenaline. "And the picture, it was an antique. Bruno's going to have a stroke." Paul stared at her, genuinely bewildered. "Girl, did you not just see what happened?" "I saw a bunch of grown men throw a tantrum," Norina snapped, grabbing a handful of ice cubes and throwing them into a bus tub. She looked up and glared directly at Paul. "I also saw that I warned you about his hand, and instead of disarming him quietly, you smashed a $200 picture. Sloppy." Paul's jaw actually dropped. Carmine looked like he wanted to shoot her, but he glanced at Vincent and kept his mouth shut. Vincent started to laugh. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a deep, rich, genuine sound that seemed to startle his own men. He leaned forward, bracing his forearms on the clean side of the table, watching Norina clear away the blood and glass with the practiced efficiency of a street sweeper. "Sloppy," Vincent repeated, testing the word. He looked at Paul. "She's right, Paul. You owe Bruno $200. Boss, go," Vincent said, the laughter fading into a soft, absolute command. "All of you. Wait outside." Paul hesitated, but nodded. "Yes, boss. Carmine, let's go." The men filed out. The front door clicked shut again. Norina and Vincent were alone in the massive dining room. The only sound was the rain against the glass and the soft thump of bloody glass hitting the bottom of Norina's trash bag. Vincent stood up. He walked slowly around the table. He didn't avoid the puddle of water on the floor. He stopped right beside her. Norina didn't stop cleaning. She wiped the table down with a wet rag, pushing the pink-tinged water into the bus tub. "You didn't scream," Vincent noted quietly. "I don't get paid to scream." "Most people would have run." "I've been running from collections agencies for 3 years," Norina said, stripping the leather gloves off her hands and tossing them onto the cart. "A guy with a broken hand doesn't really rank on my top 10 list of things to panic over." She picked up the heavy bus tub, turning to head to the kitchen. Vincent stepped into her path. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. He looked down at her, his dark eyes stripping away the waitress uniform, the cynical armor, and the exhaustion. He saw the sharp survivor's intellect underneath. "I don't just want you serving my tables." "Norina," Vincent said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp. "I need someone who sees the room. Someone who isn't blinded by the money or the fear." Norina tightened her grip on the plastic tub. "I am a waitress, not a mob wife, not an informant. I pour the coffee, I take the cash, and I go home to my broken radiator." "I can fix the radiator," Vincent murmured. He reached out his knuckles, brushing lightly against the tense line of her jaw. The touch sent a violent, unwanted shiver straight down her spine. "I can fix a lot of things for you, Norina." Norina stared up into his eyes. She saw the trap. She saw the velvet-lined cage he was building around her. "You can't fix my life, Mr. Costa," Norina whispered, refusing to back down. "Because men like you are the reason it's broken in the first place." Vincent didn't pull back. The corner of his mouth curled into a slow, devastating smile. "Then I guess," Vincent said softly, We're going to have to break it down to the studs and rebuild. The D train was 20 minutes late. By the time Norina unlocked the deadbolt to her apartment on 145th Street, it was past 3 in the morning. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and stale cigarettes. She pushed the heavy wooden door open, kicked off her damp shoes, and reached for the light switch. She stopped. The air in the apartment was wrong. It wasn't freezing. Norina walked slowly into the cramped living room. The ancient cast-iron radiator beneath the window, which had sat dead and rusting since November, was hissing softly. Heat radiated from it in thick, generous waves. Her gaze dropped to the coffee table. Sitting perfectly centered on the cheap, scratched veneer was a stark, white envelope. Norina didn't touch it. She walked into a tiny kitchen, pulled a paring knife from the block, and walked back. She used the tip of the blade to flip the envelope open. A single piece of paper slid out, along with a heavy brass skeleton key. The note was written in sharp, slanted handwriting. The valve was stripped. I had Paul replace the piping down to the basement. You sleep tonight. V. Norina stared at the paper. A normal woman might have felt flattered. A normal woman might have felt a flutter of romantic apprehension. Norina felt violated. Her apartment was a shoebox, it was run down, and the rent was consistently late, but it was hers. The fact that Vincent Costa could snap his fingers and have a man bypass 3 locked doors in a Bronx tenement without leaving a single scratch on the deadbolt terrified her far more than the guns at the restaurant. It meant there was no perimeter. There was nowhere she could go where his money and his shadow couldn't reach. She didn't sleep. She sat in the armchair, the paring knife resting on her thigh, watching the radiator hiss until the sun came up, pale and grey, over the city skyline. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Norina was back at Tavolino's. The dining room was empty, scrubbed clean of the blood and shattered crystal from the day before. The heavy scent of bleach fought a losing battle against the rich aroma of simmering San Marzano tomatoes from the kitchen. Vincent was sitting in his usual spot at the head of the pushed-together tables. He was alone. No Paul. No Carmine. He was reading a leather-bound ledger, a half-empty glass of sparkling water by his wrist. Norina marched straight up to the table. She didn't wear her apron. She bypassed the service station completely. She slammed the white envelope and the brass key down directly on top of his open ledger. The sound cracked like a whip in the quiet room. Vincent didn't flinch. He slowly closed the ledger, his dark eyes rising to meet hers. "I lock my door for a reason," Norina said. Her voice was perfectly level, which made it far more dangerous. "If you ever send your men into my home again, I will call the cops. I don't care who you own in the precinct. I will make it messy, and I will make it loud." Vincent leaned back in his chair. He studied her face. She had dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was escaping its severe bun, and she looked like she wanted to murder him. He looked fascinated. "Your landlord is a slumlord," Vincent said calmly. He was ignoring 3 months of maintenance requests. Paul had a very brief, very polite conversation with him. "The pipes are new." "I don't care if they are made of solid gold," Norina snapped. She leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, invading his space. "You don't own me. I sell you 8 hours of my time a day to carry plates. That is the transaction. You don't get to buy my comfort. Because once you buy my comfort, you think you've bought my loyalty. And my loyalty is not for sale." Vincent's gaze dropped to her hands, braced fiercely against the white linen. He reached out slowly. Norina didn't pull back. She refused to yield the physical space. He placed his hand over hers. His palm was warm, calloused, and heavy. "Everyone's loyalty is for sale, Norina," Vincent murmured, looking back up into her eyes. "The currency just changes. For some men it's cash, for others it's fear. His thumb brushed lightly over her pale knuckles. "What is yours?" Norina pulled her hand out from under his. She stood up straight. "Survival. I don't need a savior, Mr. Costa. I've kept myself alive this long without the mob fixing my plumbing." "I know you have," Vincent said softly. "That's exactly why I want you. I don't need a damsel. I have enough liabilities. I need someone who knows how to hold a knife in the dark." He tapped the brass key sitting on the table. "That isn't a key to your apartment," Vincent said. "It's the key to the front door of this restaurant. I bought the building this morning, from the foundation to the roof." Norina's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him. "You what?" "Bruno is out. He's taking a generous severance package and moving to Florida." Vincent stated his tone, businesslike. "The kitchen staff stays. You are the new floor manager. Double your current salary, full benefits, and you dictate the schedule. No more night shifts unless you want them." Norina felt the floor tilt beneath her worn shoes. It was a lifeline. A massive, unimaginable lifeline thrown directly into the drowning waters of her life. And it was attached to a cinder block. "Why?" Norina asked, her voice losing its edge, replaced by a deep, wary suspicion. "You don't care about a pasta joint." "I care about investments," Vincent replied, standing up. He buttoned his suit jacket. "And I care about having a safe place to eat my dinner without listening to Greek thugs complain about shipping taxes. You run the front. You keep the books clean. You handle the staff." He stepped closer, stopping mere inches from her. "And when I sit at this table, you pour my coffee." He walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers lightly. He stopped at the front door, looking back over his shoulder. "Service starts at 6, boss," Vincent said. The corner of his mouth twitched. Then he pushed the door open and stepped out into the rain. Norina stood alone in the massive dining room. She looked down at the brass key. It gleamed under the harsh chandelier light. It looked incredibly heavy. She picked it up. 4 days passed. The restaurant remained closed to the public, operating solely as a private stronghold for the Costa family. But the dynamic had shifted. Norina wasn't just a ghost in an apron anymore. She was the manager. She fired Sarah on Tuesday. It wasn't out of malice. It was out of mercy. Sarah couldn't stop shaking every time Paul walked into the room, and Norina refused to let the girl mentally disintegrate. She gave Sarah a month's severance from the safe in the back office, Vincent's money, and told her to focus on her theatre degree. By Thursday night, the rain had stopped, leaving the city locked in a bitter, dry cold. It was 1 a.m. The men had finished a massive, heavy meal of osso buco and risotto. They were smoking in the main dining room, the low hum of their voices filtering through the thick kitchen doors. Norina was alone in the back. Chef Artie had gone home an hour ago. The dishwashers were done. She stood at the massive industrial stove. She was hungry, but the heavy meats and rich sauces the kitchen had pumped out all night turned her stomach. She needed something simple, something that tasted like home. She threw a handful of spaghetti into a pot of violently boiling, heavily salted water. In a heavy cast-iron skillet, she heated a generous pour of olive oil. She smashed 3 cloves of garlic with the flat of her knife, tossing them into the oil, along with a heavy pinch of crushed red pepper flakes. The sharp, pungent smell of garlic, hitting hot fat, instantly cleared the stale air of the kitchen. The swinging door opened. Norina didn't look up. She assumed it was Paul coming to ask for more ice. She used a pair of metal tongs to drag the al dente pasta directly from the boiling water into the skillet, letting the starchy water hiss and spit as it hit the hot oil. She tossed the pan with a flick of her wrist, emulsifying the oil and water into a thin, glossy sauce. You didn't eat dinner." Norina paused. She turned her head. Vincent was standing just inside the kitchen. He had taken off his suit jacket and unbuttoned the collar of his shirt. Without the armor of his tailored clothes, he looked broader and far more tired. "I'm eating now," Norina said, turning back to the stove. She killed the heat and tossed in a handful of fresh parsley. "Osobuco puts me to sleep. I have inventory to do." Vincent walked deeper into the kitchen. He bypassed the stainless steel prep tables and leaned against the counter, directly beside the stove, watching her work. "Aglio e olio," Vincent noted, his voice low. "Peasant food." Norina agreed, sliding the pasta into a white ceramic bowl. She grabbed a fork. "You want some?" It was a polite, automatic offer. She fully expected him to decline. Men who ate $50 steaks didn't eat midnight garlic pasta cooked by the staff. Vincent didn't say a word. He reached out, took the fork from her hand, and pulled the bowl toward him. He leaned against the counter, twirled a massive bite around the tines, and took a bite. Norina watched him. The kitchen was utterly silent, except for the hum of the massive refrigerators. Vincent closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The tension in his shoulders, a rigid tightness he carried, permanently dropped slightly. "My grandmother," Vincent said, quietly, swallowing the bite, "used to make this when the docks were dry, and my grandfather had gambled away the week's pay. She said you only needed oil, garlic, and anger to survive." "She was right," Norina said. She grabbed a second fork from the drawer and leaned against the counter next to him, eating from the same bowl. It was an incredibly intimate act, completely devoid of romance. It was the shared communion of two people who understood what it meant to go hungry. "You handle the men well," Vincent said, eating another bite. "Paul respects you. Paul is a professional. Carmine is a rabid dog." Norina didn't sugarcoat it. "He hates me. He hates that I spoke to him the way I did. He's going to be a problem, Vincent." Vincent stopped eating. He looked at her. It was the first time she had used his first name. It slipped out naturally, grounding the conversation in a sudden, sharp reality. Before Vincent could answer, the kitchen door slammed open. Carmine walked in. He looked flush, his pupils slightly dilated. He had a glass of whiskey in his hand. He stopped when he saw them leaning against the counter, sharing a bowl of cheap pasta. His lip curled in disgust. "Boss, we're waiting on you to call the sit-down with the South Side crew." He looked at Norina, his eyes raking over her uniform. He switched to Standard Italian, assuming it would give him a shield. "Non sapevo che le puttane facessero anche da cuoche." "I didn't know whores doubled as cooks." The temperature in the kitchen dropped to absolute zero. Norina went completely still. She didn't drop her fork. She didn't look at Carmine. She looked at Vincent. Vincent didn't shout. He didn't blink. He slowly set his fork down on the edge of the ceramic bowl. He pushed off the counter. "Carmine," Vincent said softly. "Put the glass down." Carmine frowned. "Boss, it was just a joke." "Put the glass down." The tone of Vincent's voice was the sound of a coffin closing. Carmine paled. He set the whiskey glass on the nearest prep table. Vincent walked toward him. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of a man who was entirely comfortable with violence. Carmine took a step back, hitting the swinging door with his shoulders. "She is the manager of this house," Vincent said, stopping 2 feet from his enforcer. "And she is under my direct protection. When you speak to her, you look at the floor. If you insult her again in any language, I will cut out your tongue and feed it to you. Do you understand me?" Carmine was trembling. The bravado had completely evaporated. "Yes. Yes, boss. I'm sorry." "You're not apologizing to me," Vincent whispered. Carmine swallowed hard. He looked past Vincent to where Norina stood by the stove. His eyes were wide with genuine, unadulterated fear. "I apologize, Miss Norina. I was out of line." Norina stared at him. She felt the heavy, dark rush of absolute power. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. With a single word, she could have Vincent destroy this man. She saw exactly why people lost their souls in this life. "Get out of my kitchen," Norina said coldly. Carmine didn't hesitate. He practically fell backward through the swinging doors, disappearing into the dining room. Vincent stood by the door for a moment, letting the silence settle back into the stainless steel room. He turned and walked back to the stove. He picked up his fork. He took another bite of the pasta as if nothing had happened. "He'll try to kill you eventually," Vincent noted calmly, chewing. "Pride is a cancer in men like him." "I know," Norina said. She looked down at the bowl. "Why didn't you fire him?" "Because keep your friends close, and your rabid dogs where you can see their teeth." Vincent looked at her. "You aren't afraid of what I just did." "I grew up in a neighborhood where men beat their wives for burning the roast," Norina said evenly. "I'm not shocked by anger, Vincent. I'm just evaluating how you aim it." Vincent's eyes darkened. The ambient light of the kitchen caught the sharp angles of his face. He reached out his hand, wrapping gently around the back of her neck. He pulled her slightly forward. Norina didn't resist. She stepped into his gravity. "And how do I aim it?" he asked, his voice a rough vibration against the quiet air. "With precision." Norina answered her breath, hitching slightly, as his thumb brushed the pulse point below her jaw. "Which is the only reason I haven't quit." Sunday morning. The buyout was over. The massive singular table had been broken apart, separated back into the smaller, intimate booths that regular patrons expected. The "closed for private event" sign was gone. Norina stood at the front podium. She wore a tailored black suit instead of an apron. The brass manager's name tag pinned to her lapel gleamed. She was running the reservation book. The restaurant was fully booked for the week. Word had gotten around the neighborhood that Tavolino's had new serious backing, and curiosity was a powerful driver of commerce. At 11 a.m., the front door opened. Vincent walked in. He was alone. It was the first time she had seen him without Paul or a contingent of armed men shadowing his steps. He wore a heavy wool overcoat over a dark sweater. He looked less like a mafia boss and more like a wealthy, exhausted architect. He walked up to the podium. "Table for one?" Norina asked, keeping her tone strictly professional, though a faint, cynical smirk touched her lips. "No," Vincent said. He rested his hands on the edge of the wooden podium. "The week is over, Norina. The sit-downs are done. My men are back on the streets. The restaurant is fully yours to run. I've noticed. The linen bill is significantly lower without your people shattering the crystal." Vincent didn't smile at the joke. He looked at her with a profound, heavy seriousness. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick, folded piece of paper. He slid it across the podium, resting it over the reservation book. Norina looked down. It was a deed of trust. "What is this?" she asked. "It's 49% ownership of Tavolino's," Vincent said quietly. "In your name, fully legitimate, untouchable by the authorities, no matter what happens to me." Norina felt the air leave her lungs. She stared at the legal document. 49%. It wasn't just a job, it was equity, it was wealth. It was the absolute end of the D-train, the broken radiators, and the terror of the first of the month. She looked up at him. "Why are you giving me this?" "I'm not giving it to you," Vincent corrected softly. "I'm buying a partnership. You proved yourself this week. You didn't flinch when the glass broke. You didn't back down from Carmine. You see the board, Norina? I need people who see the board." I don't want to be in the Mafia, Vincent. I don't want to traffic guns or break knees. You won't, Vincent said. His voice was firm. You run the front. You keep the money clean. You give me a sanctuary in this city where I don't have to watch my back. That is your only job. He stepped closer to the podium. The space between them vanished. But I won't lie to you, Vincent continued, his voice dropping to that intimate gravelly rasp that made her pulse hammer. If you sign that paper, you are tethered to me. My enemies will know your name. Carmine will hate you until the day he dies. You will step out of the shadows and directly into the crossfire. You will never be just a waitress again. Norina looked at the deed. She thought about her grandmother scrubbing floors until her knuckles bled, dying with nothing to her name but a dialect of anger. She thought about the endless grinding machine of poverty that had chewed her up for 26 years. Safety was an illusion. The world was violent whether you were poor or rich. But if she was going to navigate the violence, she'd rather do it with her hands on the wheel. She reached into the podium drawer. She pulled out a heavy black fountain pen. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for time to think. She flipped to the last page of the document and signed her name in sharp, aggressive strokes. She clicked the pen shut and pushed the deed back across the wood toward him. I open at noon. Norina said, her voice hard, clear, and absolutely unshakable. If you want coffee, grab a booth. If not, get out of my lobby. I have paying customers arriving. Vincent stared at the signature. Slowly, a genuine dark smile spread across his face. It wasn't the smile of a predator catching prey. It was the smile of a king recognizing his equal. He reached out his hand, sliding over the podium to cup her cheek. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, a gesture of striking, grounded tenderness in a room built on blood money. Make it black, Vincent whispered. He turned and walked toward the deep corner booth in the back, the king taking his throne. Norina stood at the podium. The restaurant was quiet, smelling of rich espresso and fresh linen. She felt the heavy brass key in her pocket. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't a pawn. She was the woman who spoke the mother tongue, and the city was finally hers. She picked up the reservation book, straightened her spine, and unlocked the front door. Let the wolves come. She was ready to feed them, and that is how a survivor rises to the top. No fairy dust, no sudden damsel-in-distress tropes, just grit-sharp instincts, and the absolute refusal to bow down. Norina didn't just survive Vincent Costa's world. She carved her own throne right in the middle of it. If you loved this grounded, tension-filled, raw mafia romance, you know exactly what to do. Smash that like button, share this story with someone who loves a strong, cynical female lead, and subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into the dark human side of romance. Let us know in the comments, would you have signed the deed?